Hmm. In this story of the outside world and the inside world, with a fire between, the outside world of little screw-ups recedes now for a few hours to be taken over by the inside world of blow-ups, this time by a colossal blow-up but shaped by little screw-ups that fitted together tighter and tighter until all became one and the same thing, the fateful blow-up. Such is much of tragedy in modern times, and probably always has been, except that past tragedy refrained from speaking of its association with screw-ups and blow-ups. This story some time ago left the inside world at its very center. Dodge had come out of the timber ahead of his crew with the fire just behind. He saw that in front was high, dry grass that would burn very fast. Saw for the first time the top of the ridge at what he judged to be about 200 yards above, put two and two together and decided that he and his crew couldn't make the 200 yards, and almost instantly invented what was to become known as the escape fire by lighting a patch of bunch grass with a gopher match. In doing so, he started an argument that would remain hot long after the fire. At the time, it probably made no sense to anyone but Dodge to light a fire right in front of the main fire. It couldn't act as a backfire. There wasn't any time to run a fire line along its up gulch edge to prevent it from being just an advance arm of the main fire. Uncontrolled, instead of being a backfire, it might act as a spot fire on its way up gulch and bring fire from behind that much closer and sooner to the crew. Dodge was starting to light a second fire with a second match when he looked up and saw that his first fire had already burned 100 square feet of grass up the slope. This way, he kept calling to his crew behind, this way. Many of the crew, as they came inside of him, must have asked themselves, what's this dumb bastard doing? The smoke lifted twice so that everyone had a good chance to ask the question. The crew must have been stretched nearly all the way from the edge of the timber to the center of the grassy clearing ahead, where Dodge was lighting his fire. Rumsey and Sally say the men did not panic, but by now all began to fear death and were in a race with it. The line had already assumed that erratic spread customary in a race, where everything is at stake. When it comes to racing with death, all men are not created equal. At the edge of the timber, the crew for the first time could have seen to the head of the gulch where the fire, having moved up the south side of the gulch, was now circling. From the open clearing, they also could see part way toward the bottom of the gulch, where it was presumably rocks that were exploding in smoke. They didn't have to look behind. They could feel the heat going to their lungs straight through their backs. From the edge of the clearing, they could also see the top of the ridge for the first time. It wasn't 1.5 miles away. To them, it seemed only 200 yards or so away. Why was this son of a bitch stopping to light another fire? For the first time, they could also see a reef 12 to 20 feet high, running parallel to the top of the ridge and 30 yards or so below it. This piece of ancient ocean bottom keeps the top of the ridge from eroding, as the rock lid on the top of a butte on the plains keeps the butte from eroding into plains. But no one was thinking of geology, or probably even of whether it would be hard to climb over, through, or around. At this moment, its only significance was that it seemed about 200 yards away. When the line reached its greatest extension, Rumsey and Sally were at the head of it. They were the first to reach Dodge and his fire. Dietert was just behind them, and perhaps Hellman, though these two stand there separately forever and ask the same question: what did Rumsey and Sally do right that we did wrong? For one thing, they stuck together. Dietert and Hellman went their separate ways. The smoke will never roll away and leave a clear picture of the head of the line reaching Dodge and his burned bunch grass. Dodge later pictured the crew as strung out about 150 feet with at least 8 men close enough together and close enough to him so that he could try to explain to them, but without stopping them, that they could not survive unless they got into his grass fire. At the review, he made very clear that he believed there was not enough time left for them to make it to the top of the hill, and events came close to supporting his belief. In the roar and smoke, he kept hollering at them. He was sure that at least those closest to him heard him, and those behind understood him from his actions. In smoke, that swirled and made sounds. There was a pause. Then somebody said, "To hell with that. I'm getting out of here." And a line of them followed the voice. The line all headed in the same direction, but in the smoke, Dodge could not see whether any of them looked back at him. He estimated that the main fire would hit them in 30 seconds. In the smoke and roar, Rumsey and Salih saw a considerably different arrangement of characters and events from Dodge's. Indeed, even the roommates differ from each other. Both agree with Dodge, however, that the line was stretched out with a group at the head close to Dodge, then a gap, and then the rest scattered over a distance that neither could estimate exactly, but guessed to be nearly 100 yards. In fact, in the summer of 1978, Rumsey, Salih, Laird, Robinson, and I spent a day together in Mann Gulch. The two survivors told Laird and me that they were now sure some of the crew had fallen so far behind that they were never close enough to Dodge to hear whatever he was saying. The implication of Dodge's account is that they all passed him by, but Rumsey and Salih believe that some of them hadn't. As to the head of the column, Salih limits it to three, himself and Rumsey plus Dieter, who is also a pal and had been working on the same project with Rumsey before the two of them were called to the fire. To these three, Rumsey adds Hellman, the second in command, and indeed suggests with Dodge agreeing that it was Hellman who said, "To hell with that, I'm getting out of here," and so furnishes the basis for the charge that Hellman was doubly guilty of insubordination by being near the head of the line after Dodge had ordered him to the rear, and by encouraging the crew to ignore Dodge's order to remain with him and enter his fire. Rumsey's testimony, however, will never settle Hellman's place in the line, and hence his role in the tragedy. For Salih was positive, and still is, that Hellman was at the head of the line when Dodge ordered the men to drop their tools, but that he then returned to the tail of it, repeating Dodge's order and remaining there to enforce it. So direct testimony leaves us with opposite opinions of Hellman's closing acts as second in command of smokejumpers on their most tragic mission. Either he countermanded his superior and contributed to the tragedy, or, according to Salih, being the ideal second in command, he returned to the rear to see that all the crew carried out the foreman's orders to keep their line intact. An outline of the events that were immediately to come probably would not agree exactly with the testimony of any one of the survivors, or make a composite of their testimony as might be expected, but would be more like what follows, and even what follows will leave some of the most tragic events in mystery and litigation. Rumsey, Salih, and Dieter left Dodge as one group, took the same route to the reef. Two of them survived. Some of the crew never got as high up the slope as Dodge's fire. Hellman reached the top of the ridge by another route and did not survive. The rest scattered over the hillside up Gulch from the route taken by the first three, and none of those who scattered reached the top. As Salih said, the summer we were together in Mann Gulch, no one could live who left Dodge even seconds after we did. In fact, the testimony makes clear that Dieter, Rumsey, and Salih scarcely stopped to listen to Dodge. As Rumsey says, "I was thinking only of my hide." He and Dieter turned and made for the top of the ridge. Salih paused for only a moment because he soon caught up with Dieter and Rumsey, and actually was the first to work his way through the opening in the reef above. When asked at the review whether others of the crew were piling up behind, while he stood watching Dodge light his fire, Salih said, "I did notice, but I don't believe there were." Rumsey and Dieter went on. I just hesitated for a minute and went on too. In the roar of the main fire, that was now only 30 seconds behind them, they may not have heard Dodge, and if they did hear words, they couldn't have made out their meaning. Rumsey says, "I did not hear him say anything. There was a terrible roar from the main fire. Couldn't hear much." It probably wasn't just the roar from without that precluded hearing. It was also the voice from inside Mount Sinai. "I kept thinking the ridge, if I can make it on the ridge, I'll be safe." I went up the right-hand side of Dodge's fire. Although Salih stopped a moment for clarification, he also misunderstood Dodge's actions. "I understood that he wanted us to follow his fire up alongside. Maybe that, his fire, would slow the other fire down." Like Rumsey, Salih interpreted Dodge's fire as a buffer fire, set to burn straight for the top and be a barrier between them and the main fire. And like Rumsey, Salih followed the right edge of Dodge's fire to keep it between them and the fire that was coming up the gulch. That's smart. The question of how Hellman reached the top of the ridge after leaving Dodge at his fire cannot be answered with certainty. What is known is that he made his way from where Dodge lit his fire to the top of the ridge alone, that he was badly burned, that he joined up with Rumsey and Salih after the main fire had passed, that he told Rumsey he had been burned at the top of the ridge, and that he died the next day in a hospital in Helena. The most convincing guess about how he reached the top of the ridge is Salih's. When he and I stood on the ridge in the summer of '78, I asked him about Hellman's route to the top, and he said that naturally he had thought about it many times but was convinced there was only one explanation. While he, Rumsey, and Dieter followed the up gulch, right side of Dodge's fire, so for important seconds at least used it as a buffer protecting them from the main fire coming up the up gulch, Hellman must have followed the opposite or down gulch side of Dodge's fire and so had no protection from the main fire, which caught him just before he could get over the ridge. Salih talked so often about everything happening in a matter of seconds after he and Rumsey left Dodge's fire that at first it seems just a manner of speaking, but if you combine the known facts with your imagination and are a mountain climber and try to accompany Rumsey and Sally to the top, you will know that to have lived you had to be young and tough and lucky. The young and tough they were. In all weather, Sally had walked 4 country miles each way to school, and a lot of those 8 miles he ran. He and Rumsey had been on tough projects all summer. They gave it everything they had, and everything was more, they said, than ever before or after. As they approached the reef, its significance changed for the worse. They saw that the top of the ridge was beyond the reef, and unless they could find an opening in it, it would be the barrier keeping them from reaching the top. They might lie in its detritus. The smoke lifted only twice, but they saw a crevice and steered by it even after it disappeared again. There was an opening between large rocks, and I had my eye on that, and I did not look either way, Salih said. Halfway up, the heat on Rumsey's back was so intense he forgot about Dodge's buffer fire, if that is what it was, and having spotted the opening, headed straight for it. It was not only upslope, but slightly up gulch and to the right, and in the smoke nothing was important but this opening, which was like a magnetic north. They could steer toward it when they couldn't see it. Rumsey was in the center, Salih even with him on his left. Dieter was just a few steps behind on his right. The world compressed to a slit in the rocks. Rumsey and Salih saw neither right nor left. When asked at the review whether they saw pincers of fire closing in on them from the sides, they said no. They saw only straight ahead. Ahead they saw, behind they felt. They shut out the sides. To them, the reef was another one of those things, perhaps the final one, that kept death coming out of smoke to leave no place to run from death. They can remember feeling sorry for themselves because they were so young. They also tried not to think of anything they had done wrong for fear it might appear in the flames. They thought God might have made the opening and might take it away again. Besides, the opening might be a trap for the sins of youth to venture into. Beyond the opening and between it and the top of the ridge, they could see no flames, but there was dense smoke. Beyond the opening and the smoke, there could be fire. Beyond there could be more reefs without openings. And it could be that beyond the opening was the end of God and the end of youth. Maybe that's what Dieter thought. Rumsey and Salih felt they were about to jump through a door in a plane, so had to steady themselves, and believed something was out there that would hold them up. It was as if there were a tap on the leg. Salih was in the lead and was first through the crevice. It was cooler, and he believed his faith had been confirmed. He stopped to lower the temperature at his back and lungs. Rumsey was through next. As a Methodist, he believed most deeply in what he had been first taught. Early, he had been taught that in a time of crisis, the top of a hill is safest. It was still some distance to the top, and he never stopped till he got there. Dieter stopped just short of the opening. On his birthday, not long after his birthday dinner, just short of the top of the hill, he silently rejected the opening in the reef, turned, went up gulch parallel to the base of the reef, where for some distance there was no other opening. No one with him, neither Rumsey nor Salih, saw him do this. It is known by where his body was found. Dieter, the studious one, had seen something in the opening he did not like, had rejected it, and had gone looking for something he did not find. It is something hard to understand, fine students. Be sure, though, he had a theory, as fine students nearly always have. While Sully was cooling his lungs, he looked down and back at Dodge and the crew, and for the first time realized why Dodge had lit his fire. Quote, I saw Dodge jump over the burning edge of the fire he had set, and saw him waving his arms and motioning for the other boys to follow him. At that instant, I could see what I believe was all the balance of the crew. They were within 20 to 50 feet of Dodge and just outside the burning edge of the fire Dodge had set. The last I recall seeing of the group of boys, they were angling up the slope in the unburned grass and fairly close to the burning edge of the fire Dodge had set. When Dodge first set the fire, I did not understand that he wanted us boys to wait a few seconds and then get inside the burned out grass for protection from the main fire. Dodge's description of his fire is mostly from inside it. After walking around to the north side of the fire, I started as an avenue of escape. I heard someone comment with these words, "To hell with that, I'm getting out of here." And for all my hollering, I could not direct anyone into the burned area. I then walked through the flames toward the head of the fire into the inside and continued to holler at everyone who went by. But all failed to heed my instructions, and within seconds after the last man had passed, the main fire hit the area I was in. When asked at the review if any of the crew had looked his way as they went by, he said no. They didn't seem to pay any attention. That's the part I didn't understand. They seemed to have something on their minds, all headed in one direction. He wet his handkerchief from his canteen, put it over his mouth, and lay face down on the ground. Whether he knew it or not, there is usually some oxygen within 15 inches of the ground, but even if he knew it, he needed a lot of luck besides oxygen to have lived. Although Rumsey and Sully were to say later that the whole crew would probably have survived if they had understood and followed Dodge's instructions. It is doubtful, though, that the crew had the training and the composure to interpret Dodge's instructions, even if some of his words reached them over the roar. The close questioning Rumsey and Sully received later at the review revealed that their training in how to meet fire emergencies consisted of a small handful of instructions, 4 to be exact, and only one of which had any bearing on their present emergency. The first was to backfire if they had time and the right situation, but they had neither. The second was to get to the top of the ridge where the fuel is usually thinner, where there are usually stretches of rocks and shale, and where the winds usually meet and fluctuate. This is the one they tried, and it worked with only seconds to spare. The third instruction was designed to govern an emergency in which neither time nor situation permits backfiring or reaching a bare ridgetop. When it's that tough, the best you can do is turn into the fire and try to work through it, hoping to piece together burned out stretches. The fourth and final warning was to remember, whatever you do, you must not allow the fire to pick the spot where it hits you. The chances are it will hit you where it is burning fiercest and fastest. According to Dodge's later testimony, the fire about to hit them had a solid front of 200 to 300 feet deep. No one works through that deep a front and lives. Even if the crew's training had included a section on Dodge's escape fire, it's not certain that the crew would have listened to Dodge, would have entered the fire and buried their faces in the ashes. When asked at the review if he would have gone into Dodge's fire had he received previous instructions about it, Rumsey replied, "I think that if I had seen it on a blackboard and seen it done and had it explained so that I understood it, that I think I surely would have gone in, but of course you never can tell for sure." Dodge survived, and Rumsey and Sully survived. Their means of survival differed. Rumsey and Sully went for the top and relied on the soul and fixation from basic training. The soul in a situation like this is mostly being young, in tune with time, and having good legs, an inflexible destination, and no paralyzing questions about what lies beyond the opening. When asking whether he had ever been instructed in studying an escape fire, Dodge replied, "Not that I know of, it just seemed the logical thing to do." Being logical meant building one fire in front of another, lying down on its ashes, and breathing close to the ground on a slight elevation. He relied on logic of a kind, and the others on time reduced to seconds. But no matter where you put your trust, at a time like this, you have to be lucky.